So hi everyone, and welcome to the Ignition Community of Practice, and welcome to all the people we have here from Portugal, Ireland, the Netherlands, Germany, and one popped up from France, so you're very welcome. Just to remind you that the session is recorded, and I will disseminate the link afterwards. So to kick things off, I'm going to introduce our keynote and panelists, and then hand over to Madeline, who's here with us, to briefly introduce the Ignition project before the keynote begins. So we're delighted to welcome our keynote, Dr. Catherine Cronin, to today's session, which is going to focus on digital equity and promoting it in society in general. So Dr. Cronin is an independent scholar focusing on critical and social justice approaches in digital, open and higher education. And Catherine has worked in higher education and community education for many years, most recently as digital and open education lead in Ireland's National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning in Higher Education. So you're very welcome, Catherine, and thanks for joining us. We also have Dr. Madeline van Oostrom, a friend and a panelist today. So Madeline is the project leader for Ignition and a senior researcher in digital literacy and inclusion at Hansa University of Applied Sciences in Groningen, the Netherlands. So welcome, Madeline, and thanks for joining us. Catherine Warren is a local from SETU Waterford campus, and she's also a panelist. Sorry, Katrina. So Katrina is a lecturer in the School of Education and Lifelong Learning and is working with the Literacy Development Centre here at SETU. Katrina is also doing her doctoral studies at Dublin City University. Finally, my colleague Laura Widger is with us, and she's a co-project lead from the SETU side on the Ignition project, and she'll join us towards the end of the session. So welcome everyone, and without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to Madeline, who's going to briefly introduce the Ignition project. So thanks, Madeline.
Thank you so much, Neil, and hello everyone. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you so much, Neil and Laura, for organizing this and having this fantastic panelist today. Catherine, very happy to get to know you today as well. And Katrina, I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to share my screen now. Just practiced this before, so it should work. Yes, there it is. Okay, so we have this European cooperation partnership with these colleagues from, well, of course, Southeast Technological University, IPB, Instituto Politécnico de Bragança in Portugal, Hochschule Bremen, and of course, my colleagues also from Hansa University of Applied Sciences. And we are together in this project to build this European Digital Literacy Coalition for Inclusion, Collaboration and Innovation in Higher Education. And we do that. Oh, yes, we have a family photo here. We do that with all these marvelous people that you can see on this slide. This was from our first learning, teaching and training activity last month of March, where we were actually in Waterford, where we had these 3-day intensive activities. And what we're doing together is basically this, what we try to do is to work together and to strengthen our partners, institutions in their efforts to increase awareness and enhance digital literacy and inclusion of teaching staff, faculty staff, students, and of course also the external partners that we collaborate and engage with. And in a nutshell, I have this slide, and this is my last slide as well, where you can see that, well, within digital transformation, higher education, of course, we have together like 3 core elements. There are people, there are processes in education, and there are tools, there is technology. Now, how do we relate to technology, and what do we need actually as people to work with technology? So since digital literacy and inclusion, so digital literacy is a very broad concept actually, we first of all needed to put a focus on our work. This is why we have established a digital agenda, and we're working with a framework from the European Commission, Digcomp Edu, that helps us to work in 6 sub areas, and we've selected from these areas in a prior research that we have conducted the first part of the project and establishing our priorities. And we're going to work on a couple of tools, kits that can help us to work better in higher education and working together on it. And of course, today we are in this community of practice, the online part of it that we have launched also in March, last March, the community of practice of educators, where people like you and me learn from and with each other on the topics of digital literacy and inclusion in higher education. And last of all, we are going to work also next semester, next academic year, with students and with researchers and staff on challenges that we have in our regions and that we usually already work with as an institution of higher education in different programs with challenge-based learnings, and how can we do that also digitally with international students teams and try to tackle together the challenges of our regions. So this is less like in a nutshell our project. I'm very happy to be here, to introducing our project here. I'm very interested and looking very much forward to the keynote of Dr. Catherine. So this was my part. And I will stop sharing. I have these links that already Neil shared before, so I will stop sharing with this. Thank you.
Many thanks, Madeline. Really interesting. Thanks for that. Welcome to everyone who's joined since. Madeline has just introduced the Ignition project, and now we're going to hand over to our keynote, Dr. Catherine Cronin, who's going to take it away from here.
Thank you so much, Neil and Madeline, Laura, and Katrina. I'll just take a moment to share my screen here. Hopefully all will be well. Okay, and I'm just going to open the chat because I'd like to be able to see that as much as possible during the presentation. Okay, great. Is that visible okay?
Looks great, Catherine, thank you.
Okay, that's great. Thanks so much. Yeah, I wanted to just begin with a huge thank you to the Ignition Project and to SETU for inviting me to join you today. This is, these are topics that are really close to my heart and areas that I've been working in for a while. So I'm really excited about the fact that you're doing this, cross-national, cross-institutional project, and that I think that's a really great approach. So I'd really look forward to finding out more from you all today about how you're approaching the project. I am going to share some work from scholars globally, but I really welcome your thoughts and ideas. So again, I'll invite some participation during the presentation and hopefully also during the panel discussion afterwards. My slides are available at this link. They are openly licensed with a Creative Commons attribution non-commercial license. So all of the work that I mentioned, all of the scholars and all of the books and papers and chapters and so on that I mentioned are linked in the slides. So if you want to follow up more deeply about anything, it's easy to do that. And also feel free to reuse or remix or adapt the slides as well. I'm very, very, very committed to open education. We were talking just before the webinar kicked off about how it's wonderful that we can all join together in this virtual space, but I just wanted to share geographically where I'm joining you from. I am sitting in my home in the west coast of Ireland in County Galway, and this is an area just very close to where I live called the Flaggy Shore. My favorite walk, just along the coastline of County Clare. And in terms of it is geographically, I know some of you are joining from elsewhere in Ireland, from Germany, Finland, Portugal, and perhaps beyond. So I send you my greetings from the far west of Europe. Again, this is a keynote, but I'd like it to be as interactive as possible, as much as you're comfortable with. So I would just like, if you're willing, if you want to just type something into the chat about how you are today. And there will be more opportunities to interact as the presentation goes on. Motivated, that's lovely, Neil. Relaxed, happy, curious, happy, lovely, interested. Thanks, everyone. Excited, interested, very well. Curious, sunny, a little tired, yes. Interested, curious, receptive, relaxed, lovely, curious, hopeful. Thank you, Karen. Curious. Oh, that's lovely. Thank you so much, everyone. That helps an awful lot. Lovely to thank you for those of you who did that. And you're all very welcome, of course. Before I dive into ideas about digital equity and digital inclusion, I wanted to kind of set the table for our conversation first. I think it's important that we acknowledge the context that we are living in and working in, as we work in HE, and that is very much a time of crisis and multiple crises. So, certainly the climate crisis, the COVID pandemic, which may not be ascribed to be a pandemic anymore, but we're still very much living with the effects of deepening inequalities, both multiple and intersecting, austerity, surveillance capitalism, rising authoritarianism, and war in Europe and beyond, as well as multiple challenges and uncertainty within a higher education context. And that list, that little ellipsis at the end just denotes that, of course, this isn't a complete list, but just to acknowledge that we are living through a time of crisis, even though we're past the worst of the pandemic, and despair, a certain level of despair and perhaps, lack of hope is understandable. So I'm hoping that we are able to use this time that we have together today to kind of be more hopeful and address the issues that we talk about here together. And before, again, I do that in depth, I just wanted to share a concept that might be useful for you. It certainly has been useful for me. And it's this notion of the after times. And it was used by the academic and author Eddie Glaude in a recent book, a remarkable book called Begin Again, about the writing of James Baldwin. And this concept of the after times was originally coined by Walt Whitman. And he used it in the context of the post-Civil War Reconstruction era in the United States, which was a time of profound moral reckoning. So Eddie Glaude also maps that to another time of moral reckoning, which was this post-civil rights movement, again in the US, where many thought that the nation was poised to change, but failed to kind of grasp that change. And perhaps we're talking together from multiple countries and contexts here. So perhaps you can think of specific times of moral reckoning, in your own contexts. So James Baldwin wrote that these moments of discontinuity and crisis are a chance to grasp a new way of thinking and a new way of being in the world. But it rests on what we do in that moment of crisis, when things are particularly difficult. But it is possible to grasp a new way of being. And so Eddie Glaude in this book says that presently we are living through another, what he would consider after times right now. And we can refuse to accommodate and adjust to the status quo, to the crises, which I'll be talking about in a few minutes. And he uses this lovely phrase that we can stand askance to the way things are. And think and imagine and do differently. And I think this is really powerful. It certainly relates very much to education, to the digital. And I think it's a really powerful metaphor in relation to the work that we're all doing. So some people sometimes ask, if you're talking about digital and open education, why start here? Why focus on power and inequality? Well, it's because power dynamics and inequalities operate in and through digital technologies and digital infrastructures in particular ways, as we all know. So issues such as privacy, data protection, data ownership, surveillance, algorithmic bias, analytics, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that any talk or any work about the digital equity, digital inclusivity, digital literacies has to begin with an understanding of what's at stake. So I won't go into this in depth. This is just wonderful work by Miranda Fricker about epistemic justice, but I really love this concept that she uses. She has done enormous work on this concept of epistemic justice and says that in order to theorize justice, we need to study injustice because the negative imprint reveals the form of the positive value. So in terms of inequality in and through digital technologies, we can really get into the work of, well, how is inequality visible? How does it happen? And then how can we avoid it? How can we build towards digital equity and digital inclusion? So it is important, I would say, to kind of dive into, how and in what ways things are operating in unequal ways. So there's a huge body of work that we can look at. I'm sure there's a body of work that you've done even in the early days of this project. I'm going to highlight just a few examples, in the whole area of artificial intelligence, the topic du jour. This particular key paper on the risk of large language models, I think, is an important one. It's written by Emily Bender, Timnit Gebru, who are pictured and co-authors. Any of their work is really important, but I cite this paper on the dangers of stochastic parrots. Can language models be too big? Emily Bender is a professor of computational linguistics. Timnit Gebru led the ethical AI team at Google and was fired from Google for putting her name on this paper. Google had asked her to be anonymous in the paper and she refused and she was fired. And she has since started the Distributed AI Research Institute. But this paper is a key resource, I think, for all of us, anyone really wanting to understand the risks of large language models, and to dive into that in a way not beholden to the large tech companies and big tech. But even before all this current debates around AI, a lot of this really important work was going on and being published. And again, this is just a selection of work. Sophia Noble, her book Algorithms of Oppression. She dismantles the idea that search engines are neutral. Some of you may have seen her work already, that algorithms privilege whiteness and especially white males and act to reproduce existing inequalities. Ruha Benjamin, her book Race After Technology, writes also about how seemingly neutral algorithms and applications can worsen racial bias. Kathy O'Neill wrote Weapons of Math Destruction, about how the use of big data and algorithms in advertising, policing, education as well can lead to decisions that amplify inequality. And the fourth book there, Data Feminism, which is available openly, by the way, by Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein, is packed with examples. It's a really lovely, practical book, which shows how what their 7 principles of data feminism, intersectional feminism, can help work towards justice. So there are a lot of people helping us to theorize, how digital technologies and digital structures can lead us towards unequal outcomes. But what about universities? What about our context, HE, where we are all working in? Of course, they are mutually constituted, digital and social inequality, and they operate within as well as outside of higher education. So all of these issues that I've just mentioned around datafication, loss of privacy, surveillance, act and can be reproduced and are often reproduced within higher education, as we all know. So that brings us, I suppose, to our work individually and collectively to understand and prioritize the notions of digital equity and digital inclusivity, because without intention to combat inequality, these will not be possible. So I asked Laura and Neil in the discussions that we had before I prepared the keynote, if there were any specific definitions that you were using in the project for these terms. And it didn't seem that there was a project specific definition. There are multiple definitions in the wild for these. So I use the plural form of definitions as a header for this slide intentionally. So this is one definition, which comes from the National Digital Inclusion Alliance from the US. And they define digital equity as a condition in which all individuals, these are my highlights, and communities have the ICT capacity needed for full participation in our society, democracy, and economy. So you may, I think it's really useful as a collective, if you're working together, to maybe tease out, what definitions you're all operating from, perhaps in your different institutions, different disciplines. It can be a really useful exercise, but this is one. And digital inclusivity is different. But I really wanted to know, before sharing any definitions about that, what you think and how you would define digital inclusivity. So there's a QR code. And also, if you don't want to use a QR code, you can just go to menti.com and enter the code that's on the screen there. And Laura, you might put that in the chat. I'll change my screen so we can see the word cloud. But I'm just inviting you to put up to 3 words. Words are preferable, or just short phrases about how you would define or what you think inclusivity, digital inclusivity is. Equity. Very good. Progress. And I'll leave this up for a couple of minutes to give you time to think. Liberties, interesting. Democratic discussion. Equality. This is great. access. Now, as the word cloud gets bigger, this is going to be my challenge to try and identify the new ones. Democratic discussion, equality, equity, access, accessibility. Very good. Fairness, empowering, consistent, wonderful, utopian, fair. Consistent, so important. Enabling, distribution, knowledge is wonderful. Yes, I apologize that I can see in the chat there, the code has actually updated since the last time I used this slide. Apologies for that. QR code is working, okay. The joys of Menti. Apologies to those of you who are not working, and hopefully you can get in with the QR code. Okay, I thank everyone who's entered something here, and what I will do is I'll share this back with the Laura and Neil and for the project, because I think this might be interesting for you just in terms of a project. But this is a huge umbrella description of equity and inclusivity, and thank you for that. And please keep going if you wish. I'm going to go on and share the definition of digital inclusivity from that National Digital Inclusion Alliance, just FYI. And again, a definition. So the NDIA defines digital inclusivity, interestingly, as activities and actions necessary to ensure that all individuals and communities, including the most disadvantaged, have access to and use of ICT, working towards digital equity as a goal. It requires intentional strategies and investments. So interestingly, this is a whole team, the NDIA, again in the US, but they define digital equity as a condition, a state, or a goal, something that we're working towards, and digital inclusivity a little bit differently as the activities, or the ongoing activities, actions, and strategies to work towards that goal of digital equity. So again, it could be really interesting for you all to tease out how you are using these terms, because people do use them differently. And the NDIA includes these 5 aspects of digital inclusivity, which are, of course, affordable, robust broadband devices, digital literacy, technical support, and appropriate agentic applications and online contact. We'll talk more about agency in a few minutes. The notion of digital equity and digital inclusivity, I talk about this importance of teasing out what it means and what it means to different people. I can't emphasize the importance of that enough, because this is the root of deciding what we will work towards and how we will work towards it. And the questions that you ask anytime in innovation is suggested about, who is included, who is excluded, why, what can we do, and so on. And this paper was just published about a month ago. It's a multi-authored paper. The lead author is Caroline Kuhn, and it's really quite different, and I recommend it highly. And they really isolate that currently many bodies, including education, who are wrestling with digital inequality, if they are guided by simplistic, uncritical, apolitical accounts, are more likely to entrench inequality. So the notion, they use the notion of a kaleidoscope, and each of the authors of the paper uses a different theoretical construct to theorize digital inequality, and they offer it as a gift to readers that you can use one or two of the various lenses to address your own issues. So things like the capability approach, critical pedagogy, Nancy Fraser's model of justice, It's a really excellent paper. So again, it really digs into the notion of critical. And I tend to always append critical when I'm talking about digital literacies, because critical, in the social science sense, simply means, revealing and questioning power relations. So I like this author by Jennifer Ross and colleagues, which says quite starkly that understanding power dynamics, inequalities, and oppressions at work in and through digital technologies stands as a precondition to educating fully literate, fully competent digital citizens and technology users. So by all means, we need to do the skills, the applications and so on, but that needs to be married with analyses of power and social inequality. And the question isn't whether we include that, but really how best can we facilitate those conversations interwoven in our work with staff, with faculty, with students. How best can we facilitate those conversations around inequality? So if, in composing a list of what critical digital literacies are, here's, I present this for just discussion and consideration. These are some things that might be on a list of critical digital literacies, things like capabilities to navigate technical tools and practices, of course, interrogate digital multimedia texts, interrogate things like authorship, bias, source, geography, and so on, design and create critical digital texts for individuals, be they faculty, staff, students, to be able to create and revise on an ongoing basis their academic, public, and online identities, and explicitly to understand power structures and inequalities around digital technology and data. And ultimately to cultivate agential capacity. So there's an ongoing commitment to engage in improving one's, critical digital literacies for agency in digital spaces. But I would really be keen, using this or your own, perhaps somewhat different definition of critical digital literacies. I would be keen to know how you feel about your own critical digital literacies, about developing them, and how you feel about them in relation to your own teaching, or if you're not teaching in a classroom, your support perhaps of staff or students. So I'll leave this up here. And again, I apologize for the code mix-up. It worked in the test. It's not working today. But if you can use the QR code, that would be wonderful. And again, I'll leave this here for a minute or so you can see. I'm very interested in the fact that the first two are very similar. I would say that for myself as well. I would say that I feel confident in my critical digital literacies, but I continually feel that I want to develop them as well. So that's interesting to see that. And then it's another level in terms of having the capacity to support students in developing theirs, admittedly. Okay, that's very interesting. It is just continual ongoing work for self and as a supporter. Thank you all so much. It's great to see these responses. Okay, I will go back to the slides just so I don't run out of time. I might just check the chat just to see if there's are there any questions, or does anyone want to make any comments in case I'm off base with this definition of critical digital literacy that I'm using? Would anyone like to comment? I'm just looking at the chat here.
We do have one comment there, Catherine, where someone says that supporting students always helps to develop their own capacities, which
what a wonderful comment, Mags. Yes. Teaching is learning. Mm-hmm. That's brilliant. Thank you. And, as I hope I'll mention in a few minutes, just that notion of modeling oneself, if one is teaching, modeling oneself as a learner is so powerful. And I know that you do that, Max. Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone. I'll just go on. I want to share, I know you are using DigCompNG, which is a fantastic resource. I wanted to share just 3 resources that I'm aware of, which really use this notion of critical digital literacies as central. And the first is the Think Data Project, which was published, it says here, in 2021. It was a 2-year project, I think. Partners were in Kenya, Spain, Uruguay, and the UK. And they intentionally meshed building and supporting technical abilities with a critical approach, and then developed a suite of OER to support educators in improving their own critical digital literacies and working with students. So there's some really lovely resources there. The second, again, all the links are on the slides. The second example I wanted to share is from the American University of Cairo. And this was developed again over the last year to 2 years. And it's a suite of tools to use in classrooms, whether you're doing professional development with staff or you're teaching students. And it's just called the Digital Literacies Toolkit to facilitate, as it says, the integration of digital literacies into courses. So are things that you can actually pick up, adapt. They're all published as open educational resources, so you can adapt them, change them, mix them with some of your own materials. It's just really nice to have resources developed by other educators in different contexts to kind of jumpstart things if you're teaching critical digital literacies. And the third example is from a project called Equity Unbound. The link is at the bottom there. I was involved in starting this with Maha Bali and Mia Zamora in 2018, and it has continued to develop every year. I've been less involved the last couple of years, but the impetus of it was we, as 3 educators in Egypt, the US, and Ireland, were wanting to help our students to explore critical digital literacies with an equity and intercultural learning focus, and do that openly. So we're using open tools to connect our students to develop critical digital literacies and interact with each other. So again, there's a whole suite of resources available on that website as well. And anyone who uses them is invited to become involved in the consortium of educators. So just wrapping up, I know we want to have time for the panel. It, of course, is, I know it's embedded in your own project, a fundamental responsibility of us as educators to help develop digital skills and competences underpinned by an understanding of how power works in and through and tangential to digital technologies. And more than that, I think, to imagine equitable and just configurations, that notion of moving from inequality to equality or injustice to justice. And Ruha Benjamin, who I mentioned previously, has a lovely quote. She says, "Only by shifting our imagination can we begin to think of a world that is more egalitarian, less extractive, and more habitable for everyone, not just a small elite." So I know that you are doing this already through your project. So I would love to find out more about how you are perhaps connecting faculty and staff across institutions to do this. Perhaps connecting students, and if you're using open practices to facilitate that networking to do that. And that notion of having a collaborative systemic approach and modeling questioning, modeling learning, modeling develop our own critical digital literacies, modeling collaboration and trust and hope is so important. So, in using that notion that I shared at the beginning about the after times, just asking ourselves together how we can muster the courage and energy as a consortium, as a coalition, to do this necessary work in the midst of all these crises is really powerful. And there's so many examples from history and also some of the ones that I shared today of that this is the only way really to do it, is collectively, collaboratively, and together. And a lovely paper by Farhana Sultana about climate coloniality. She writes that it is in many acts, small and large, acting in constellations and connectivities over time and place that bear results. And that's if you look at social justice movements across history, as well as, work in digital education that I've described. So one further resource, which I just added this morning because I thought I should mention it, is an upcoming publication, which I have co-edited with Laura Cherniewicz, which is 70 scholars from 17 countries, which write not just about the digital, but about higher education and resilience tactics, collective action, critical data literacies, infrastructures of care, and models of collaboration. And this edited collection will be available in September. We believe it'll be published in September. The link is there, and I would invite you to explore it. And I will leave the last word to James Baldwin, who had such a commitment to justice, and that is that hope is invented every day. So I look forward to learning from you, and that's all for today. It's my website, and I am on Mastodon if anyone wants to connect there. And I'll stop sharing.
Thanks so much, Catherine. That was really interesting. A couple of insights that I didn't realize, kind of challenging these power structures that are at play can help bring about kind of this criticality. You know, the whole thing with the AI generative tools, which we're working on a bit in our department at SETU. Somebody described them to me as being pale, stale, and male, that even though they're not supposed to act in a certain way, because the internet and a lot of what we see and do can be biased, that these tools are actually learning this bias. And I know there's some tools brought in to combat that, but really interesting. And thanks so much for that. So I'm going to hand over to Laura, who'll kick off the panel discussion. And I know there's a couple of questions that have come in as well that perhaps they can be addressed during the panel discussion. So take it away, Laura.
Thanks, Catherine. Just to echo Neil's words, very interesting and very stimulating presentation. Lots of summer reading, so it's good, which is good to see some of the key theories that are evolving this space, some of the kind of more recent literature, which is great, and some of the kind of forthcoming literature, which is good too. So we have, as Neil introduced earlier, we have our two panelists, Madeline from Hansa University of Applied Sciences and Katrina Warren from our Literacy Development Centre here in Southeast Technological University. So to you, Madeline, just as they're kind of to respond to Catherine's presentation, how does it kind of relate to maybe your own practice or research or work that's ongoing in your own programs, or maybe some strategic initiatives that are happening in your university?
Yeah, thank you, Laura. And congratulations, Catherine. Really enjoyed so much listening to you and having many thoughts crossing my mind while you were talking, trying to follow their track. So very learning, very great presentation. When I think of my research or my work at our Hansa University of Applied Science, I recently wrote a piece of a vision paper, a proposition paper on digital inclusion for our board of directors, or our board. And I'm working on trying to work with colleagues on kind of an agenda also for our institution. And one of the things that is in that agenda, first is what we have now recently, last month, teamed up with the National Association and Alliance for Digital Inclusion in the Netherlands. That's been promoted by the Ministry of Internal Affairs. So we're really trying to team up with other national or regional leagues that has the same mission. And another thing that I really am inspired to do, also because I teach at the master program on digital technology, and I teach at the School for Communication, Media and IT. I'm very interested in promoting now like an innovation lab for digital inclusion, or digital inclusion by design, because we educate designers and builders of technologies. And one thing that is really the most difficult thing that I'm not trying to get a grip on, and I would really like to ask Catherine for some insights, is I would be very interested to establish conversation with colleagues from different programs, from all types of disciplines, and to ask them, how can we introduce digital inclusion in the curriculum in a way that the professionals that we train, we educate, is more, has more tools on the one hand side, but more awareness, but also more tools to handle in their day-to-day future professional life with digital inclusion. That's maybe one of the biggest challenges for me at this moment. So I'm really looking forward, for example, if we have examples, how can you in a institution of higher education introduce this conversation with different program managers, with different disciplines, the people that you are educating? How can you make that shift, that mindset, looking into this digital inclusion mission, if you want to call it like that?
Thanks, Madeline. Madeline, Catherine, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, that is that's probably just the toughest question, isn't it? It's one thing to accept as individuals that we must engage with these questions, but then when we face into our institutions, it's how do I engage across disciplines, senior managers, with other institutions and so on. I think the notion that the word that you all use of coalition, I think, is key. And that is that there are scholars who are doing this, very challenging, critical work in all over, in the global South and the global North and so on. Many of them are working in open education because open education has had a strong critical movement for some time, and embedded in open is the digital. So open education has been dealing for several years now about using digital tools critically, how to engage with openness critically, knowing that, again, opening education can exacerbate inequality as easily as, reduce it. So I think the notion of coalition amongst yourselves, but also seeking out people who are doing this. So there's an event, for example, called MyFest, which you can look up online. It stands for Mid-Year Festival. It's a learning festival. It's all open. It is put on by a group of these educators that I've just described. Last summer was the first one. This summer is the second one. And there's just a series of gatherings, webinars, and so on over the summer, where people are sharing their resources and how they're actually doing this. There's a couple of chapters in our upcoming book about purchasing large applications and software in institutions, and it's written by someone at a very high level at an institution about the questions that need to be asked. And Anne-Marie Scott is one of the authors, and she has, I quote her from various keynotes she has given, saying, we sometimes give more attention to the tea bags that are all bought into universities and where they're from than the large, technology applications. What we need to ask those difficult questions.
Yeah, I think very, very relevant, Catherine, definitely that question.
Fair trade and all of that, yes.
100% around that, and kind of some key questions within that. And very interesting. That project, MyFest, sounds really, really interesting, and definitely kind of something to look up, and even to bring some of that practice maybe into our Ignition project for how they're kind of sharing. To Katrina, just kind of same question. If there's parts of you're working within the Literacy Development Centre, I know you have a lot of kind of community orientated and that idea of coalition, community orientated programs. Is there maybe aspects of your own kind of practice or experience or research or programs that kind of resonates with some of what Catherine's talked to there?
Thanks, Laura. Thank you, Catherine. That was fantastic. And as Laura said already, lots of reading to do over the summer. I suppose what resonated with me there was your quote at the beginning, the after times. When we went into COVID, we kind of went into emergency remote teaching, and the equity there and inequalities for our students, but our own competencies as well as staff and tutors, but also our students having to share devices, broadband being not good, and then their capacity to engage with our digital tools and technologies. I think we may have jumped forwards thinking everybody now has caught up, but they haven't. And I suppose what I'd say, we can't lose sight of that all our learners are at different stages of their own digital skills as well and competencies.
That's such a powerful point, Katrina. Yes, agreed.
Who's developing the tools that we're using, and are we, as you said, modeling for our students as well? A lot of my students are tutors in further ed, so they're working with students who are even more disadvantaged with regards to digital skills and access to digital tools. So it's about not forgetting all our learners are different, all our contexts are different.
Yes, I 100%, and I'm so glad that you raised that so explicitly. Yeah, I agree with you. I think that, during the time of COVID, for all of us, I often thought that whatever we understood about inequality before COVID, we understood a lot more, during COVID. A lot of these differences amongst students and the issues that students have and staff became visible. And then, unfortunately, for those of us who want to prioritize equity and care, we kind of zoomed right past that again. And meanwhile, those issues are all still there and should be as visible and deserve as much attention. So absolutely. And I think that's inherent in taking a critical approach and always asking those questions. So, yeah.
And that links in, Catherine, to a question that we have from one of the attendees, where they've asked, they said, Catherine, you spoke of modeling for our students. Mm-hmm. What are the three main challenges for HEIs in the post-COVID world? Have HEIs lost the ground they made during COVID? And maybe some of this is covered in your new book that's coming out.
Yeah, well, I mean, the new book is, we invited people, to contribute. It's intentionally very global. So authors come from, I think, 17 countries. And, so there are a lot of different contexts, North America, South America, Asia, Europe, the US, and Canada, and so on. So it won't, it's interesting sometimes that approaches from different contexts can kind of provoke us to look at things a little bit differently. And that's what we hoped for. But yeah, I mean, identifying the three things is difficult, but certainly I think we have the sense of rushing to get back to some sense of normal is disappointing. We had an opportunity where we really saw the importance of issues of equity and care during COVID. And I think it's up to any of us who still know that those issues are there to always bring them into the room, whatever rooms we're in. And, I have been asked, in rooms before, we don't have to talk about equity so much, do we? Yes, we do. We put it on the table. It's important in every conversation. So be that person, engage students. So prioritize equity, I think, is the first one. And it has to do with every decision in every project. Who's in the room, who's not in the room, who is included, both in the impact of the decisions we're making and also around the table making the decisions. Quite often we say we need student involvement, and we'll invite one student rep to be involved, and we'll invite them late on in the process when the project has been designed already. And there's a notion called intentionally equitable hospitality. There's literature on this. I'll type it into the chat, which really teases out, how important it is to engage different kinds of students, different kinds of staff, staff who are permanent, staff who are temporary, so on, right at the beginning, when we're designing solutions about things, so that those questions get raised and we make the best decisions. And then the notion of care. I mean, there's certain things that we saw during COVID that we can't unsee. We know that students are living, have financial hardship. Maybe that's been exacerbated. We know there are students with disabilities who being able to operate virtually was an asset, rather than something that was a deficit. So how can we provide choice and care for all learners and all staff to the extent that systems can accommodate that? And finally, one of the big and very, dangerous moves that happened during COVID was just the intrusion into HE of many corporations, which used it as an opportunity to say, listen, we can make this easy for you. We can do, exam proctoring and, connect your students. So we must ask questions and look at contracts, dissect them about data, about privacy, and so on, about all of those third-party companies that have played very central and active roles in higher education now. So those of us with, IT, data expertise really need to come to the fore there.
Yeah, read the small text, I guess. Very much so. We have a comment here from Anne Walsh, where she talks about the words from The White Tiger. Mm-hmm. The moment you recognize what is beautiful in the world, you stop being a slave. So she's using this quote, says, has resonance for the digital world and digital inequality. So the project has the capacity to empower through embracing what is beautiful and liberating about technology and tackling what makes it slavish and inequitable. So I think that's a very important, it's a good way of looking at it and thinking about, well, what is beautiful and liberating? And I think liberating is a very important concept and very important term. But then also thinking about, well, what does make it slavish and inequitable is a good way of analyzing and looking at it.
Yeah, that's beautiful, Anne. And I think, I love that idea about, it's important to analyze inequality and work towards, more equitable outcomes. And also the power of the imagination in imagining better futures, more equitable futures, more beautiful and liberating futures, and painting those pictures for people so that it's clear to the people that we're working with, the people we're trying to convince, Madeline, but what we're working towards, and why it's valuable. So thank you, Anne.
So Madeline, for you as well, you talked there, you've various initiatives that are ongoing in hands. Is there, and even within your own programs, it's very interesting to hear how you're working with your students. Is there particular ways that you're kind of looking at the technology and questioning kind of what makes it slavish or inequitable? Or a lot of this technology is very recent and very emergent?
Yeah, this is a great question, actually. And it's very accurate for me at this moment, because we're developing a course for next year, a new course. And actually, I have this some ideas for this workshop, but on digital literacy, so critical digital literacy. I will now immediately incorporate the critical mention as well. For me, one of the things that I tend to stress with students, specifically these technology based students, I mean, we train them, the future digital developers and designers. It's about the digital divide, and it's like one of the trends. I give a lot of workshops also in trend analysis and scanning the environment, risks and opportunities for innovation within digital technology developments. And I always stress this digital divide and the digital inequality actually as the trend, I think, in nowadays society. And what I ask students, and what I try to make them look from a point of view of how do the things that they've been building in the last years or projects, are they able in hindsight to discover like the exclusive, how you say that, how it contributes actually to digital exclusion in a way that you could consider, could I have made this, could I have designed it or built it more inclusive? And this is one of the things I think I'm very much interested in discussing with colleagues, also more the technical ones, and bringing digital inclusion as the trend nowadays that we have to really pay attention to in education when we train and educate these programmers.
Yeah.
And a question for Catherine would be there for me, if I can still, or for you, Laura, as well. So my guts say that with this new development of AI and all these, massive chat GPT and other based tools and applications, the divide is actually growing. Do you have signs of that already? Where do you see the most, the biggest danger, as a matter of fact, and how we as teachers should pay attention to that? That would be for me now a very actual, very relevant question, and maybe for colleagues as well.
Catherine, would you like to respond to that?
Sure, and then please jump in, Laura. Yes, I mean, again, from this, network of educators, critical educators who I would, be communicating with, to always enhance my own critical digital literacies, many ideas that have come up. Certainly, knowing that students are using the tools means, bringing the discussion into the classroom as a first principle, of course. Many people will talk about how it can be used in academic context, but widening the lens, talking about the very low-paid workers in Kenya who are, are being, abused in a great extent by companies because they're vetting the information, by ChatGPT that ChatGPT is sharing. So work by Emily Bender, Timnit Gebru, they have done an enormous amount of work on this. And then even the body of work, again, work by Emily Bender, the body of work that ChatGPT drew from, they shared their source materials. You could look and see where they drew all their information on the internet. They did not share it for GPT-4, which is interesting. But for GPT-3, a lot of it is Reddit. A lot of it are spaces where, who are the primary people who are in these spaces? Who are the primary people who can safely be active in those spaces? And what are the conversations going on in those spaces? And in all of those, criteria, it skews hegemonic. It skews, white, male, privileged, global north, and so on. So that is the body of data that's being used to produce, everything that we're getting back. And just bringing that discussion into, the classroom so that students understand that more so than should we use it or shouldn't we use it. I think those are important discussions in terms of critical digital literacies.
I 100% agree, Catherine, and I think it talks back to what you, Katrina, what you were mentioning about, and Madeline, about the digital divide and what's the digital inequity and inequality that's there around devices and access and the ability to use technology. In terms of my response to that, we're going to have to wait because we're nearly out of time, and it kind of points very well to our next session, which is going to take place in early November. So we have a kind of a leading professor in the space of generative AI who's going to be talking to and answering the question about, can generative AI foster greater digital inclusion? I don't know what the answer is, and a lot might have changed in this space between now and November. So I just want to say thank you very much for a really interesting discussion, and I'm just going to hand over to Neil for the final word just to close out.
Super, thanks Laura. Thanks to Catherine, that was really excellent, and the discussion afterwards. This is what a community is. You learn so much from the people who are just being here and the ideas that are percolating, and it's so relevant to today's education system. Thanks to Madeline. As always, a pleasure, Madeline, and tapping into your knowledge base is hugely helpful for us at SETU, and I'm sure for other people here. Last but not least, Katrina, thanks very much for being involved. Really interested to hear your insights as well. And just to thank all the participants who came and engaged, and I hope to see you guys at the next COP, the Community of Practice from Ignition. I did post our website's link in the chat, but please get engaged with us. Please join us and help us to grow our digital agenda. And we'll close it up there. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone in the chat. Nice to see such nice kind of comments coming in. So really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. And I'm inspired by what you're doing and how you're doing it. So I wish you well.
Thanks, Catherine. Thank you.